Welcome back to Executive Protection Insights. I'm Liam. Today, I want to take a bit more time on a topic that, in my experience, sits at the center of many problems in executive protection, but is rarely addressed directly, and that is people. More specifically, the kind of people you bring into an executive protection team. Because one of the most common assumptions I see, especially in Fortune 500 environments, is that security experience is transferable across functions. That if someone has a background in corporate security or has worked in a structured security environment, they can transition into executive protection without much adjustment. And on paper, that makes sense. They understand security, they understand procedures, they understand risk. But in reality, the transition is not that simple, and very often it fails. Not because the individual lacks competence, but because the role itself requires a completely different way of thinking. If we take a step back and really look at corporate security, it's actually a very well optimized discipline. It's built for environments that are structured, repeatable, and controlled. You have a building, a campus, a facility. You define the perimeter. You control access points. You monitor activity through cameras, sensors, patrols. You create procedures for almost every scenario. And over time, those procedures become the backbone of the operation. The system becomes the strength. And the people operating within that system are there to maintain consistency, to follow process, to execute within defined boundaries. And there's another layer to this that's important. Corporate security is designed for scale. You're not protecting one individual, you're protecting hundreds, sometimes thousands of people, employees, visitors, contractors, all moving through the same environment. So the approach has to be standardized. You can't tailor protection to each individual. You build systems that apply broadly. You create rules that work across large populations. And success comes from consistency, from predictability, from stability. Now compare that to executive protection. The first thing that changes is scale. You're no longer protecting hundreds of people. You're protecting one, maybe two, maybe a small group. And that immediately shifts the entire approach. Because when you move from protecting many to protecting one, you lose the ability to rely on generalization. Everything becomes specific. Everything becomes intentional. Everything becomes tailored. There is no good enough. There is no average. And then comes a second shift. The environment disappears. There is no fixed location, no stable perimeter, no consistent conditions. Everything moves. The protectee moves, the team moves, the environment changes constantly. And with that, the risk changes constantly. So now you're operating in a space where you don't control the environment. You don't control the variables. You don't control the timing of what might happen. You are constantly adapting, constantly reassessing, constantly making decisions. And this is where the gap between corporate security and executive protection becomes very clear. Corporate security is designed to reduce variability. Executive protection is designed to operate within variability. That difference alone changes the type of person you need. In corporate security, you want someone who thrives in structure, someone who follows process, someone who values consistency, someone who can execute the same task the same way every time. In executive protection, you need something else entirely. You need someone who is comfortable when things are not clear, someone who can operate without a predefined answer, someone who can assess a situation quickly and act. Because in executive protection, time is compressed. You don't always have the luxury of escalation. You don't always have the luxury of discussion. You don't always have the luxury of confirmation. You have to decide, and you have to move. And those decisions are often made with incomplete information. You don't have the full picture. You never do. You have fragments, signals, context, experience, and you have to build clarity in real time. That requires judgment, not just training, not just certification, but judgment. The kind of judgment that comes from exposure, from experience, from understanding how environments behave and how people behave within them. Another important difference is anticipation. In corporate security, you respond to events. An alarm triggers, An incident occurs, a process is followed. In executive protection, the goal is often to prevent the event from ever happening, to see something before it develops, to adjust before it becomes a problem, to redirect rather than react. And that requires a very different mindset. It requires awareness, continuous awareness, not passive observation, but active interpretation. Reading environments, reading people, reading behavior. Because sometimes the most important decision is not the one you make, but the one you make early enough that no one else notices. Then there's communication. And this is another area where the difference is significant. In corporate environments, communication tends to be structured, layered, documented. There are channels, there are protocols, there is time. In executive protection, communication has to match the pace of the environment. It has to be immediate, clear, and sometimes minimal. Because over-communication can be just as dangerous as under-communication. Too much information at the wrong moment creates hesitation, and hesitation creates risk. So the people you bring into executive protection need to understand communication, not just as a function, but as a tool. They need to know when to speak, what to say, and when silence is the better option. And then there's something that's harder to define: presence. How someone carries themselves, how they move, how they observe, and how they interact with the environment without drawing attention to themselves. Because executive protection operates in public spaces, in visible environments, often in close proximity to other people, and the objective is to be effective without being disruptive, to be protective without being intrusive, to be present but not noticeable. That balance is not easy, and it's not something you can fully teach. It's something that develops or it doesn't. So when organizations build executive protection teams using the same criteria as corporate security, they often select the wrong profiles. They select for structure when they need adaptability. They select for process when they need judgment. They select for control when they need fluidity. And over time, that mismatch shows up in small ways at first: slower reactions, over-reliance on procedure, difficulty adapting when things don't go as planned. And then in more critical moments, it becomes more visible: hesitation, confusion, breakdown in coordination. Not because the people are not capable, but because they were selected for a different type of environment. So if you're building or scaling an executive protection program, the question you need to ask is not just who has security experience. It's who can operate in uncertainty, who can move with intent, who can make decisions under pressure, who can think ahead instead of just reacting. Because executive protection is not about standing still and controlling space. It's about moving through complexity with precision, with timing, with awareness. And this is where everything connects: people, process, technology. If you bring in the right people, but force them into rigid, static systems, you create friction. If you have flexible systems, but the people cannot adapt, you create gaps. It has to align. Because executive protection is an operational discipline, and operations are only as strong as the people executing them. At the end of the day, this is what it comes down to. Corporate security is built to protect environments at scale. Executive protection is built to protect individuals in motion. And those two realities require different systems, different thinking, and very importantly, different people. And when you get that right, everything else becomes easier. Decisions are faster, movement is smoother, risk is reduced without increasing complexity. Because the goal is not to create more structure, it's to create the right structure for a dynamic environment. I'm Liam, and this was Executive Protection Insights.